Agile for Humans is brought to you by Audible.com. Get one free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/agile. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player, including Scrum, The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time by Jeff Sutherland, and Crucial Conversations by Carrie Patterson. Visit www.audibletrial.com/agile to enjoy your free audiobook today.
Processes and tools dominate today's Agile discussions, but we are devoted to the individuals and interactions that make it work. From the beginner to the veteran practitioner, we have something for you. Welcome to Agile for Humans.
All right, we are back. It is the first episode of 2016, so Happy New Year to everyone out there. This is another episode of Agile for Humans. I'm your host, Ryan Ripley. Joining me tonight, a good friend of the stream, Tim Ottinger, made an introduction, reached out and said, Ryan, I want you to meet Bill Caputo. He's a smart guy. He's a wonderful Agilist, and he has this crazy idea that I think would be a great fit on your podcast. So I reached out to Bill, and he graciously agreed to join us. So, Bill, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ryan. It's really great to be here.
And what Bill has done, he has set up twelfthprinciple.org, and I'll let Bill give the intro to it and talk about what exactly it is, but he's essentially embraced one of the Agile principles from the manifesto, and he's, well, I'll let Bill go ahead and dive in. What led you to this? What are you doing here? And, if you could just give the overview, that would be great.
Sure. Like you said, Tim and I have known each other a long time, probably going on 15 years now. We were all working together to try to understand this thing called lightweight methodologies back in the day, and then suddenly there was the Agile Manifesto, and everyone was buzzing about that. And really, the 12th principle is not much more than an extension of what we've all been trying to do for the last 15, 16 years, which is get at what makes for successful software delivery and try to do a little bit better every time we go out to do it again. But the site itself sort of grew out of actually it grew out of an online conversation between Michael Feathers and Mike Hill, two more Object Mentor alums like Tim Ottinger. They were debating whether or not scaling Agile was just code for command and control. Debating is probably the wrong word. I think they were sort of asserting that it was, and whether or not that was okay. And I found myself saying, I'm with you, fellas. It's scaling and it's okay. It's command and control, and maybe it's okay. And that led me to say, is there really anything in the Agile Manifesto that is anti-command and control, or says really anything about the organizational structure of the wider organization around a delivery effort? And so I popped open the Agile Manifesto and gave it a quick reread. I hadn't done that in a few years, and what jumped out at me was that no, there really isn't. It's very centered on individual project efforts. Most of the subjects, if you look at each individual value in the 12 principles, all but one of them, the subject of the advice goes toward individuals or project level concerns, except one. So that 12th principle, if you will, was the one that we pulled out and made into the site after some conversations with some other people around me that are interested in such things. And the rest of it just sort of came out of trying to clarify this idea that if there's nothing inherent in the manifesto that says anything about organization, where did that come from? Why is that so ingrained in the Agile culture, the idea that Agile will bring this egalitarian, collaborative, everyone works together and trusts one another? Where does it come from? And what I think is, I'm not sure what I think. That's why I built the site. I wanted to get out there and start to have conversations with people. I have some ideas, but no concrete beliefs on what that is.
So what we're calling the 12th principle, just for the listeners out there, it's really the build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment and support they need, and trust them to get the job done. And I think you're absolutely right. It's almost like a leap of faith, right? We're going to do this agile adventure, and there's going to be organizational nirvana, and things are just going to come together. But wait a minute, how do you actually get there? And so I think it's a very interesting conversation that you've sparked by really embracing this principle and saying this is the end goal. Now work backwards, almost in a way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's some of that here. I think like any good evangelical statement or flag in the ground, if you will, it gives people put into it, I think, a little bit of themselves, and the manifesto has that element to it as well. It was great watching the commentary when the site went live, and it sort of took off there. We got something like 600 people signed it in the first 48 hours, and I think the total is somewhere around 800 now have signed it. But
it's a very interesting way that you went about collecting signatures too. Mm-hmm. It's the first time I've seen Twitter used as the signing mechanism, and I think that really helped spark the discussion, spread the popularity. So wherever that idea came from, very good one.
I give at least half of the credit, if not all of it, goes to Ben Rady. I work with Ben. He and I have known each other for a long time, and I raised to him the point that I did not want to do a signing similar to the manifesto, where people put their email address in, mainly because I didn't want to build the infrastructure and set up a mail server and have to read through them. Laziness is what's Larry Wall's principles, right? Laziness is a virtue of a programmer. But
I think it said programmers needed hubris, laziness, and what was the other one?
I think it's impatience.
Impatience, right.
So I've got all of those.
Oh, I think most of us do, but it is an interesting concept. I'm curious some of the responses you've gotten. What's the feedback look like? What are the questions that are coming out of it? How has the conversation moved forward since you've launched this site and really have sparked a conversation around this very important principle?
There were some definite themes in the commentary online. And at this point, I'm still kind of letting it ferment. And also I have a whole bunch of things going on. So we're about 2 weeks out, and I haven't put up any official response to those comments, but I've got them all cataloged. And at some point I'm going to organize them. But some definite themes popped out. There was the theme of, oh, here we go, another religion. This is the Protestant Reformation for Agile. Which was doubly funny because I think we were kind of joking along those lines when we first started talking about it. Because it is, when you make a statement like this, when it's specifically when you take something out of context that you try to generalize, such as the values and the principles in the manifesto, it's easy for people to just that resonates with me. This is me, man. These people are like me. And I think that's healthy and even necessary to get an idea to spread. But at the same time, the criticisms that were flying around was, when are people going to learn that you can't just build, you can't just boil software delivery down to sound bites. Well, I actually happen to agree with that. You can't. But you can't get a conversation started either with, a doctoral dissertation. You got to start somewhere. And I think getting at what goes on in organizations, Agile has a lot of traction in a lot of organizations and has come under a lot of criticism for turning into its opposite over the last decade. And the question that I find most interesting is why? Why does that happen? And what can we do about it? So that was the theme. And I saw a lot of people saying, yes, this is what is essential, is this trust. And some people saw motivated individuals as the thing they cared about. Those were a couple of the themes. There were more, but I figure I'll give you a chance to take this in a different direction if you want. But.
No, I think part of the issue, and I think you've hit on this somewhat as well, is that people aren't thinking about the principles. It becomes very simple to take them at face value, to take them at a very literal interpretation and run with them, thinking that you've hit on the right path. But what you've done here is taken this particular principle, and now people really have to think about. So if we're going to embrace building projects around motivated individuals, there's a voluntaristic aspect to that. So we can't force people to be on agile teams. And then what does that mean to your organization? And taking that conversation into your leadership team and really breaking that down and looking at give them the environment and support they need. Well, now you have to talk to developers and business people and find out, why aren't you successful? Why are you successful? What is the environment that would be, the best way for you to succeed? And then finally, trust. Is trust in your organization? What does that look like? Can we talk about trust? Is it safe to say there's no trust? All these things pop up simply because you're willing to have the conversation, as opposed to, giving this principle a quick read and then not asking any of the thousands of questions behind the initial statement.
Yes, I think that is the case. And, and the values have always gotten more traction than the principles anyway, right? Because they're on the front page and they're very pithy, and we the structure has been copied many, many times. This on the left over this on the right, and and parodied and everything else over the last 15 years. And well, not quite. I guess we're not quite 15 years of Agile yet.
We're not that old yet.
Not that old. Although I was on the XP mailing list, I think around 99. So for me, this feels like a long time. And yet I still see a lot of differences in that time. But one thing that hasn't changed is this idea that if you have, I think it's in the text on the 12thprinciple.org site. It's not essential to have any particular organizational structure. Not only have I seen Agile successfully practice, whatever that might mean, in multiple different types of contexts, but I've seen success that doesn't really qualify as Agile in contexts that are very different. I don't think the structure of the wide organization is either necessary or defined by Agile. But what is essential is that the organization around it, the culture, the environment of the delivery effort needs to not be toxic to that effort. If you look at the other values and principles of Agile, you can create an environment that is toxic to that, toxic to collaboration. For example, if you do something like forced ranking has become popular in many different organizations, the CEO or whatever his name was over there at GE, I guess it was, at the time, and that book was aimed at how do you weed out upper middle management that are competing with one another for the C-level positions in a big corporate environment. Well, forced ranking might make sense there because those people all have careers if they don't make it to the suite. But when you start applying that to programmers and saying, okay, everyone, I've seen this before, everyone on this team is going to be forced ranked and your bonuses are going to be allocated accordingly. Well, there goes collaboration right out the window, because no matter what you do, everyone's going to be looking at everyone else and saying, my gain is your loss. And in fact, in that environment where I saw it, what we did for a while was we just said, we're just going to divide by N, where N was the number of people, whatever bonus pool was given. And believe it or not, the wider organization eventually told us to stop doing that. That's an example of toxic to some of the values of the environment, right? If you're trying to foster collaboration and trust, but you won't let people help each other without costing themselves something, that's toxic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's Jack Welch who was the
Jack Welch.
CEO who initially came up with that, and then a lot of HR professionals took it to the most extreme level. But what's encouraging now is that I think Harvard Business Review recently ran an article where around 10% of the Fortune 500 has dropped that practice. They've seen that, or the pay for performance practice does not work, and that a force ranking type system is demotivational. So it took a number of years to get the big brains to come to that conclusion. But I believe 10% of the Fortune 500 has dropped the practice. It seems to be swinging the other way, which is a very good sign. But you're right. If you and I are on a team and you need help and I'm ahead on my work, what's my incentive to help you? Why wouldn't I want to trip you instead? And it's one of those things, I look at the 12th principle and I think, give them the environment. And I really think in some ways you could look at that and think, give them the system. Give them the systems of work and the support within those systems to get the job done. And I think that's an important way to look at it, because every system around the people contribute to create the environment. It's not just a pool of programmers, a PM, a manager, and a business person. There's also HR, legal, finance, and all the processes and overhead and ceremony and baggage that they bring in that can also totally pollute the pool that everyone's working in.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And another theme of some things that I've been interested in a lot lately is I don't know if you've noticed, but I've been throwing rocks at metaphor lately and our use of metaphor in the delivery world. And believe it or not, I see these two things as related, and it hinges right on that word environment. Because if we want to describe in the most general terms, technology delivery and what is successful and if we want any way of comparing in different efforts, I think our reliance on metaphors like productivity metaphor, manufacturing metaphors, where productivity comes from, hinders us in doing that. And if instead, I think modeling what we do as a system would make a lot more sense. We have much richer analytical tools if we borrow from systems theory and those kinds of pretty well established disciplines. And when you start talking about systems, you have the system and you have its environment. And when you do that, you start to see, all the people interacting, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Well, what I hear there, individuals and interactions, is really just another way of saying social system. And that ties very nicely to the environment in the 12th principle. So yeah, I think you have to look at the wider environment. I think you have to look at the wider organization. How is HR helping you to recruit people and motivated individuals? I mean, if you're not tied into that properly, you're not going to get anywhere either.
There is this drive to always compare the work to something else, though, and that drives us to that metaphor kind of paradigm. It's easier to talk about the work than it is the system. And so then you get into the situations where we're talking about the work as building a house or comparing it back to manufacturing. And then we get stuck in those discussions about, optimization and productivity, which are really boring conversations in the context of software development, at least in my opinion. I know that you have a recent post about productivity and how it's time to retire that metaphor. I'm wondering if you could dig into a little bit of that and how it relates over to this 12th principle thinking.
Okay, sure. The connection is a little bit distant. There may be different sides of a pyramid that ultimately leads toward my thinking on theory in general. But if you think of metaphor and our use of metaphor, it's been a thing of mine for quite a while now, maybe a year and a half. I've really gotten it in my head. I wanted to dig into how we talk about what we do. I think I mentioned this to you in an email. 10 years ago, when I left consulting, I thought I really understood how to do all this, and I thought and I went off to do it. And what I found out was I didn't know what I was talking about, but nobody else does either, right? And but the catch is, I think we have a good understanding of how to do this. I think we're really bad at talking about it. Like, we don't have good language. If you look at even computer science, let alone technology delivery as the application of computer science, does not have good language to talk about what we do. We have we can talk about computability. We can talk about decision theory. We have good language there. But compare the social element of what we do, the non-computable part of what we do, to the rest of the sciences, and we look terrible. We have no good language. We rely on all these half-baked metaphors, or ones that we inherited from the business world, like manufacturing, and we keep trying to twist them and apply them and get very pedantic about their definitions, and we collectively as a group we seem to think that if we can just nail down those definitions of what is productivity, we will have this licked. And I don't believe that. I just think what the metaphor is a bad one, and it should be retired because it's not coherent enough. It's not deep enough to give us the kind of analogical reasoning that we need to talk amongst ourselves. We don't have the depth of knowledge of manufacturing, and we're not necessarily dealing with manufacturing experts anyway, to use it to map technology delivery to their comfort zone. And so I think clarifying our use of metaphor is an important first step in getting a better ability to intersubjectively, amongst ourselves, share knowledge and not just ideas and catchphrases on what we do.
And part of the difficulty, I think, around that is even a simple manifesto, right? So we've got 4 values, 12 principles, and how badly twisted has that become? And now we're trying to talk about more complex manufacturing theory and apply it back to software engineering, development, and delivery, which is, and maybe I'll get some emails and tweets about this, but I think it's a blend of art and science. And we're trying to cram that theory-laden manufacturing world into a hybrid of art and science, and it's just not working. Mm-hmm. But even, like I was saying, even with the manifesto, very simple statements, very clear statements, and even those have gotten butchered. So what do you think is once we get past the metaphoric thinking, do we move away from sound bites? Do we move to, peer-reviewed journals and all these data-driven discussions, or what is that next step that creates the language that we need to clearly express these ideas to the greater, wider audience?
I wish I had that crystal ball. I don't know.
Oh, come on, Bill. You got to know the answer.
I'm not a very good futurist. I really am not. I'm really good at looking at the here and maybe at the past and the future. I'm not one of those people who writes a year end, here's what's going to happen in tech. It's not my thing. But, I think what I see around us is I think you can find the answer to all of our problems in the Church Turing thesis. What is computable is what computers can describe algorithmically. Everything else, whether it is not, right? And you can, in different branches of knowledge, that gets different terms. Philosophically, epistemologically, it's metaphysical, right? But whatever you want to call it, the part of technology delivery that involves dealing with people and figuring out what their problems are and communicating that to each other in a lossless kind of way is, to go back to computing terms, it's at least NP-hard, right? Or something along those lines. It's not going to it's not going to resolve itself to an algorithm. There's no rule set that's going to teach us how to do technology delivery. And that's kind of a good thing, because we'd all be out of a job because someone would write a program to write all the programs. And so I don't think there's any answer in the sense that someone's going to define the methodology that's going to, ensure success. But I do think it may be also true that our biggest problem, though, is all the superstition and half-truths and sales pitches and all the rest of it that gets in the way of people actually learning to do this better. Because the people can definitely learn to do it better, because I've seen them do it. I feel that I've gotten better at this over the last 15 years, as I'm sure some people who worked with me 10 years ago would tell you if they were to work with me today. And sometimes they do. And, we were better at what we did 10, 15 years ago. So.
Well, and I wonder if it comes back to something even simpler, and something that you've sparked with your site is just being willing to have the conversations around the types of principles and the work that we do. Because I notice, my career is based on pretty much 16 years of Fortune 500 companies and working in these large organizations and these large company type environments. And we don't spend typically a lot of time talking about how we do the work. Mm-hmm. We talk about the work we need to do. And so I wonder if just getting back to having discussions, trying to carve out a couple hours a week and say, these are the things, these are our practices, these are our systems, do they make sense? And really trying to let's take this principle and let's spend an hour just chewing through it, and how does it really apply here, and where have we lost trust, or where do we not support people, and then start working through that. It gets back to the concept of a retrospective, I think, which Agile installed and tried to bring, but I find, and maybe your experience is different, but I find that talking about how we do the work is not as common as the work is not as common as talking about the work that we need to do.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I've been very fortunate over the last 6 years to be working on the same team, with the same team. Not every member is the same. Some are. Some of them have been there less, but still several years. And so I have to reach a little further back, and so I'm actually going to reach back, I think, to probably around 2003 or so. I remember having a conversation. I was still working as a consultant at the time. I had probably even blogged this along the way. I really got fed up with roles, and I wanted to focus on activities. I remember I just read Deming's New Economy, and I was really enamored of that book. And just to show you how things rise and fall in favor, I remember being excited about it and talking about it on the Extreme Programming mailing list and getting feedback from people that we didn't want any of that Six Sigma-like stuff in here. And now Deming, via the lean stuff, has come right into Agile to the point where people will probably be surprised. But if it's not what you're used to, people react negatively. And so systems of activities was a thing for me back then. And so I didn't like the idea of having a retrospective the idea of a programmer, but programming and retrospecting were things that you might want to do more frequently even than every week. I mean, if you're not thinking at least a little bit about how the today went and getting feedback from people, well, it's like Kent Beck's old metaphor of driving a car by holding the steering wheel really tight and pointing it down the road versus constant adjustments. I absolutely think that good teams spend time thinking at the meta level about what they're doing or how they're doing what they're doing and not just what they're doing. My current team does not have anything resembling formal practices for this, though, because we've iterated on this so many times that, now we have a conversation and we all know if somebody's having a hard time with it. And usually it's just, I can tell you're having a hard time with this. Let's talk about why. As a team lead, I feel like that's my only real main responsibility at this point, is to make sure that everyone is okay. Even the people who aren't like me, who like to, talk endlessly and throw their opinion out, forget baking it. Let's just throw it out there while it's still raw eggs and some flour and see whether there's anything worth going with. Some people aren't like that. Some people want to think everything through and form their opinion and then share it. And so you have to be sensitive to that. And I don't think any process fits all, including, hey, we're going to have weekly retrospectives. Well, if that works for your team, that's the right answer. On the other hand, you might want to have someone who's very sensitive to how people think about interacting with others and check in with them on a more frequent basis. It's so context driven. But I do agree with you that it's probably not done as much as it needs to be, because we're always in a hurry, right? We're always got to get it done. We're always got to get it right the first time. Clearly, I'm not in that camp. I don't believe that.
But it's a thought that's been expressed before on the podcast. I think we talked about retrospective frequencies with Woody Zuhl, the no estimates advocate, mob programming. I think he is one of the founding people of that process, but it seemed like mob programming is just a constant retrospective wrapped around a programming activity. So you have this constant feedback of the whole team working on the software. It's one of those take an idea and blow it out to the ultimate level. I think you're right. The idea that why wait till the end of a sprint to deal with an issue if you can handle, if you can do a 15-minute retrospective on something that just happened and get past it and move on, why not do it on the spot as opposed to following ceremony, structure, those types of things. But it also gets back to, this is empiricism. We're supposed to inspect and adapt and act transparently. So it's like you said, if more frequent retrospectives are what your team needs, do them. Don't be bound by the chains of some rule in a guide or in a book. Create the environments that provide the support that people need, right? I mean, that's what we're told to do.
I think, honestly, we had the answer 30 years ago when Jerry Weinberg wrote Secrets of Consulting. His Rudys rutabaga rule is as good as any rule I've ever heard of. If you're not familiar with it, you should go read it. It's a great anecdote. It's a great book, whether you're a consultant or not. It's a great book about just interacting with other people. But Rudys rutabaga rule, like I said, I'll leave the story why it's named that to Jerry to tell. But the advice is figure out what your biggest problem is and then solve it. But when you do that, remember your number two gets a promotion. So So you're always going to be you always have a biggest problem, no matter what you're doing. But I believe in that book, Jerry says people who are effective at solving these kinds of problems or any kind of problems, it's not that they have fewer problems, they have smaller ones. They have lots of little problems instead of a few big ones. And I think that applies to things like how frequently should I retrospect? I think when you phrase it as an activity, by the way, I think it starts to sound kind of silly. How often are you retrospecting today? It sounds kind of silly when you put it that way. But if you,
or how often do you care enough to check in with your coworkers to see how they're doing, how things are going, and think, yeah, when you start talking about it like that, it is kind of silly to even ask, isn't it? You would think you'd want to do it as often as needed.
Exactly. And maybe, maybe that's, and that, well, not maybe, it will be different for every group of people and every person who's thinking about it. If you're someone who worries a lot about how people are getting on the team, and that's you could be thinking about this all the time, and actually it could interfere with your effectiveness, right? If you're constantly pulling people out of what they're doing to go, hey, I noticed you hesitated for a few minutes in that meeting, are you okay? Right? Pretty soon they're gonna be like, yeah, I'm fine. And I think just ultimately the worst thing you can do is create an environment where people don't feel comfortable talking about how they're about problems. That is really the only thing you really need. And we're back to the 12th principle. Like, if you don't create an environment where people feel comfortable saying, yeah, I really wasn't okay with it. It's one level of dysfunction, or maybe we'll flip this over. It's one level of effectiveness if they're willing to talk to whoever's, quote, in charge, or anyone who has taken on this role informally of the person everyone confides in. That's going to work, but it's even better if they can just say, you and I work together and we're in a meeting and you say something that puts me off, and I can just say, Ryan, I want to check in with you there. I didn't quite, that didn't feel right to me. Are you saying that you didn't like what I did on that? And you can say, and then you feel comfortable with saying, actually, I really didn't. I didn't know how to bring it up. I'm glad you mentioned that. Like, that's healthy. But that environment takes a lot of commitment and I think time to build. You won't get people that trusting, just by saying, hey, we're going to do agile now or anything else.
We're going to trust each other now. Everything's safe now. Fire away.
Yeah, we're going to send you to training today, and it's going to make sure that when you're done with training, you guys should all be trusting. So if you're not trusting, I need to know about it, or else.
That's right. And we'll put you on an action plan to get you there.
Yes, there's a remediation. We'll send you to remediation, and the first one won't go in your review, but the second one will.
I think it's also important, when the principal says give them the environment, and like you said, it's very difficult to build, but I think there also has to be a commitment to maintenance and maintaining that environment, and almost cultivating it, protecting it, shepherding it, making sure that it actually stays. And people like you, like what you were saying, where you see your role really as being that that person who keeps that environment sound, and having companies and teams that make that commitment also seems just as important as the initial build out of that environment and support structure.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I think one thing to always ask yourself whenever these things come up, people who, one thing I've learned in the 20 years I've been doing this for a living is that not everybody thinks about these meta questions or finds them particularly interesting, but wants to go to work as a programmer. So those of us who do have to remind ourselves that, or at least I feel like I have to remind myself that you should always remember who is the you or the we or the they that is responsible for these things. Take a step back and say, can it take care of itself? So if I'm tasked with the role of team lead, I feel that's part of my responsibility. But even if I'm not, it's something I will probably try to do, at the very least, with my interactions with others. And if I see someone struggling, I have a tendency to step in and go, hey, you feeling okay? Something I can do to help, which is probably why I keep getting stuck as a team lead, which I don't really particularly want to be. I'd rather be a programmer. But I made peace with that a while back. But yeah, I think you have to ask yourself, how do you maintain the system? But honestly, I think the system, if it's effective, will maintain itself, in the sense that we're talking about a complex adaptive system, as it's not a game. I know people have used that metaphor, but there's no rules here unless you consider politics rules or a game, and I don't think it is. I think a political systems model describes a software effort or a technology delivery effort very well. What you see if you look at political systems theory is that the members, the interactions of such a system are concerned with the value, the authoritative allocation of value of such a system. And if you look at whether you're looking at a political system of 5 people or a nation, such systems have a tendency to persist. So the question really is how do you make sure you don't break it, right? Especially once you have it. If you've established trust, that's the most valuable thing you've got. Maintaining that is really about just not doing anything to break it, right? And if the environment is turning toxic, creating that context bubble that protects it. And I don't know any rules on how to do that, but you have to focus on its existence, and you have to care to keep it that way. And then it becomes politics.
Right. And I think you hit on it, just the awareness, just looking around and realizing there are systems in place, and that if those get broken, or if there are people that come in and become bad actors, that it can be broken. I think that's something that not most people think about, that this is something that could be torn down.
Yeah, and I think that's why I like the metaphor of a bubble. By the way, I'm not anti-metaphor. I don't know if we want to go back to that for a second, but metaphors have a valid purpose. They can be used to teach. They can be used in research if they're deep enough and scientifically structured analogies. But they're very useful for explaining one concept in terms of another. What I think they stink at is sharing knowledge amongst experts, unless you're very, very careful. So I wanted to put that out there because I've already been accused of being anti-metaphor in some of the conversations this week, and not with you, but with others. And that really isn't what I'm on about. It's just we're misusing it.
I was going to highlight your hate of metaphors in the show notes. Glad you brought that up.
Yeah, I'm glad you did.
I think most people get the nuanced point that if you want to convey a general concept, the metaphor is great. But when you're talking to software professionals and you're trying to take one deep, complex topic, tell a metaphor about it, and apply it to another deep, complex topic, a lot's going to get lost in translation. And I think that's really the driving point there.
Well, and there's method that needs to be established there.
Right.
You can use metaphor to reason analogically, but the goal of that type of reasoning, assuming you have a deep and coherent enough metaphor, if something in the source domain suggests that it might exist in the target domain that you're trying to learn about, that is grounds for that becomes a hypothesis that you need to go test in the target domain. It doesn't. I saw someone talking about how as willpower declines in the afternoon, people eat more junk food, and I saw that extended to software development. Well, this is why we have bugs in the afternoon, because our willpower is dropping. It's like, well, that's an interesting hypothesis, but you can't just start running out there and saying it's a conclusion. We need to. If we were anything like other empirical learning type folk, we would actually say that's it. Let's go find out if that relationship holds. So that's how I want to see us use metaphor better, is to rein in our tendency to jump to conclusions, because we're programmers who do those kind of intuitive leaps, I guess, all the time. And some of us are very, very good at it. Some of the metaphors and how people use them are probably effective for them, and I'm sure they're effective for them, but they won't necessarily be effective for others. And that's where I think we get hung up, is we share this knowledge as if it's knowledge, and really it's just personal experience. I'm guilty as charged. I've used metaphor very effectively over the last 20 years to convey my ideas to others. I just wouldn't necessarily recommend you try it. So
your mileage may vary.
Your mileage may vary. I mean, how many times have we seen YMMV in arguments about agile over the last 20 years? It's like, well, of course it will vary. It doesn't stop us from thinking we're right, though.
Well, we're all right within our own little bubbles and contexts.
Yes.
And it's like you said, when you try to jump out of that, all of a sudden that's where the friction takes a hold. It's funny, I was looking at our good friend Tim Ottinger's Twitter feed, and he had just retweeted, someone was quoting the famous metaphor, programming is like building a house. Mm-hmm. And
I saw that.
and they said by a programmer who knows nothing about building a house to another programmer who also knows nothing about building a house. I thought that was just spot on to the metaphor conversation, is that we constantly want to pretend that software development is like building a house, and none of us have typically built a house. So how the hell would we know?
Exactly.
What are you talking about right now, you know?
Yeah, those two programmers don't know anything about building a house, and I would say they don't know anything about using metaphor either.
And if they're really talking like that, they probably don't understand developing software either.
Yeah, that's probably well, maybe it works for them. We always have to say that in the absence of solid foundations for knowledge sharing, I've gotten in this habit over the years. If it works for you, great. And in fact, I abandoned Agile for a long time, in the sense that I stopped describing myself as an Agile practitioner. I don't feel like I've ever stopped doing extreme programming, but I don't know if an XP person who's read XP Explained would look at what I do and think there's none of the practices are here. It's like, well, if you look, they're there. But I've gotten it to the point of saying, well, hey, whatever works for you, that's the thing you should be doing, not what somebody wrote in a book somewhere. And I think this is the heart of that. Two guys talking about building a house and how that's exactly right, the code they wrote the other day. Oh, I don't know. If their customers are happy, I suppose that works, right? I think a lot of our current focus is on much more psychological knowledge sharing, where we use a metaphor or an analogous area, and we try to map people's experience into that. I think that can work for individuals. I think it works great for direct transmission of, if I work with you for 5 years, we can use a metaphor to talk about that time when we did that thing and, we got that project out on time. That works great. But reaching out across time and space to people, I think this looks very interesting. I'd like to look at this in more detail at some point.
And I think the key to the work that Dan's doing is that he's trying to map the things that we do into a business pattern language, so that we can sit down with a CEO and have a discussion in their terms and about things that are important to them, but still express all of the things that are important to us as well, such as building projects around motivated individuals, but saying it in such a way that resonates back to the business. It's an interesting way to go, but it's certainly one of many efforts in that area.
Well, imagine if after the working title, by the way, for my metaphor stuff is a Bonfire of Metaphors, and I want to burn them all. And but maybe what rises out of the ashes of that is we can reclaim some of these metaphors. And I think it's only after we've done our due penance and gotten them fully out of our system and replaced them with much better models for reasoning and sharing knowledge. But where maybe manufacturing comes back someday is in this type of thing, where if you want to talk to the head of a manufacturing facility about the technology delivery efforts in his organization, or in her organization, or in their organization, or whoever you're talking to, what you need to do is find a domain that they understand, that they're an expert in, that you can map your domain that you're an expert in to them. That's a teaching metaphor, and that's what this looks like to me. This looks like a very coherent, structured collection of deep metaphors, and I think that has a lot of value. I don't know that it has a lot of value in the other primary way of using metaphor, which is research and expert-to-expert communication. To pick on my other favorite metaphor this week, to pick on tech debt, and the two very different meanings of that one. The problem with going around and saying, hey, you have a lot of tech debt, you should pay down the interest on that. Well, if you're talking to financial people, you're working with bankers, that might be a good use of the metaphor, which is what Ward Cunningham was using it for in the first place. But if what you're doing is talking to programmers, skip that and say, hey, you need to refactor here. You guys have got so much cruft in this code. You've got there. There's a 1,000-line method there. Time to do some refactoring. The metaphor gets in the way. If they don't understand those terms, or they don't understand. Take it to a more technical, let's get out of the agile terminology and just simply say, hey, I think you need to consider changing out the underlying technology of what you're using. Don't use metaphors for that. Go ahead and talk about the underlying technologies. Say you need to replace this with a queue, or maybe you need to introduce a single-threaded model here because there's some kind of weird race condition here. Don't use tech debt to substitute for all of that technical conversation. And if the person you're talking to can't understand that and yet is responsible for the technology delivery, well, I think you have a different problem.
Yeah, and I wonder if a lot of that is just lazy thinking. If we've gotten into this pattern or this mindset of, I'm gonna use these metaphors to get out of this conversation or to not dig deep, or maybe I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's
lots of reasons, right?
Lots of reasons. I think if I was going to generalize them, which I like to do, this touches on something I've been calling the pedantic curse, or paleo-positivist thinking that I see in our industry. We have a tendency to, and I don't know if it's because we're programmers and so we think in precise terms, or I have some other ideas on where this comes from, but we seem to have this belief that if we just define everything just so, we will solve this knowledge sharing problem. And so I think some people, at least, they have very clear ideas of what they mean by tech debt, and they think in it and they can use it effectively. And they're out there with that very precise definition. And so they want to talk to you in that definition. And so you can always tell when you're up against the pedantic curse because they'll correct your definition of tech debt, which is a metaphor. And then they'll maybe even go so far as to say, here, read this first, and then we can talk about this. And I just think that's kind of, the positivists tried this with the science, the logical positivism in the 20s, the Vienna Circle, they tried this and it was roundly shot down and is now discredited in the rest of the sciences. But it seems to be alive and well in the idea that, if you just specify everything up front and decompose from there, you'll have your correct answers at the end. It doesn't work well for software, and it works even worse when it comes to talking about software.
Yeah, so let us define our terms, and now let's have an argument.
Yeah, that's known as Twitter.
No, we do. You forgot the hashtag.
Oh, right. Well, no, pretty soon it'll be 10,000 lines of that instead. No, here, let me post my dictionary to you, and then we'll argue.
I am killing my account if they go to 10,000.
Yeah. Oh, same here. I just saw that today. I'm like, well, there goes the last reason I had to use Twitter, which was it was giving me brief updates on what people were thinking.
The odds of me reading any tweet right now are low. 10,000 character tweets is 0.
Yeah.
If I want to read that, I'll read a blog post.
Exactly. I mean, and as someone who's taken to blogging again, they serve very different functions. Twitter is very useful for sharing sound bites. So I know we've jumped all over the place, and believe it or not, there's actually source material I have that ties all these things together. I thought I'd summarize them real quick for you. There's the idea of technology delivery in the widest sense. How do we describe that effectively so we can talk about it? Then that's the idea of technology delivery systems. And I've touched on that I find a lot of value in the political systems theory for describing what we're doing. There's computer science in there somewhere, and if you saw the Peter Naur article floating around this week about programming as theory building, a 1985 paper that Alistair Coburn had as an appendix in his book in 2006. As you probably picked up, I like reading philosophy, and I had been reading philosophy of science stuff last year, and I came to a similar conclusion. And I had not seen Peter Naur's paper until yesterday, and I literally flipped the table when I read it, and actually kind of happy because it cuts a big chunk of effort out for me. I could just say, like Peter said, instead of having to build it up from scratch. But I really believe that this so-called delivery system that I'm talking about, all these interactions about value, the value in question is this development of a theory that lives in the minds of everyone involved, not just the programmers, but all of the stakeholders who care about the value. And those computation artifacts that we're delivering is the model in the same sense that there are equations that describe regular physics theories. Our computational models describe that theory. And all of this lives in the context of this environment of this delivery system. And the role of metaphor in all of this is the glue that kind of holds all this together. If we can put metaphor back where it belongs, which is in this teaching role, and maybe building good, deep scientific metaphors as we model using systems theory, because it's not that technology delivery is a system or a theory building exercise, but it can be modeled as one. So if we want to use the deep metaphor of theory building because what technology delivery is ultimately is technology delivery. It's not anything else. It's not like anything else. It is itself. So metaphor can play a good role there. And ultimately what I feel like all of this leads back to is maybe if we can clear all that smoke out of the way, and then things like, well, what is the value of the 12th principle and other ideas like this? All the agile principles and other principles and good ideas, we can actually start to put them on some sound theoretical basis. Can we investigate trust in an organization? What do the trust relationships look like in an org? And do they matter for how the teams are does it matter? Can we maybe finally define success in some intersubjective way instead of you'll know it when you see it, or your people are happy? I'd love to have a better definition of success that we could compare our efforts with. All of these things tie together in my mind with just at the end of the day, and with none of that available, what we all fall back on is just following intuition and being open-minded. So that's what it always comes back to for me until someone solves this other problem.
Well, and I think those are some great words to wrap up on. And so, Bill, I'm very happy that Tim brought us together. I really love these topics, the use of metaphor and the 12th principle. I love the idea that people champion a principle. They spark conversations about digging deeper. So I really appreciate that you created this conversation. You've created this site. Because it's an important principle. There's 1,000 questions behind it that every organization has to ask themselves on how they're going to apply and not only just bring that principle into their org, but how they're going to live up to it. So it's a really important conversation that I really appreciate you sparking and championing.
Well, I thank you for that. It's great to find people who are interested. I mean, that's why I started this. And in fact, I see this as just the beginning. I've started another initiative, a larger initiative called Agnomia, which I hope to have that site up sometime in the next week. I should have made it a criteria of doing this recording, and I probably would have got it done too. But I work in the financial industry, and I have no plans on leaving, but I wanted an actual entity to start to explore these things and to work with others to explore these things. And so this whole topic that we've been talking about, the 12th principle, is just one pillar of that, if you will. And I hope to create this, my vision of this is almost like a research institute. I want to bring people together to try to answer some of these questions and start to build a good foundation. It's just an enormous undertaking, and there's a lot of people that have more knowledge about these topics than I do, and I want to go out and find them and bring them all together. And I hope that 12thprinciple.org in a year has a whole train of articles where people are doing actual research into how trust affects success. Maybe we'll find out that the whole principle is BS and it has nothing to do with success. That would be fantastic if we had that knowledge, because right now we don't even have that much, right? So that's what I'm hoping to do, and agnomia.com should go live here soon, and when it does, that's where I'll tie everything together.
Well, we'll be sure to get a link in the show notes, and hopefully a few months down the line, maybe we can check back in with you and see how things are going.
That would be fantastic.
Well, at this point of the show, we allow the guests to plug anything that they have going on.
Guess I just did that.
Right. So you jumped the gun on that.
Sorry.
No. You're fine. Plug anything that they have going on, any other sites, any other things on their mind, any book recommendations, anything that they'd like to get in front of the audience before we call it a night.
Okay. There's so much background material to all of this. For metaphor, I think the best book to check out is the Lakoff book on conceptual metaphor. After I turned 40, I lost the ability to remember anything. It's kind of frustrating. Things I talk about an hour earlier, I cannot remember. Hold on, let me get you a title.
No, it's funny. Ever since we had kids,
Yeah.
I've told my wife a few times, I just can't remember anything. I know where their soccer ball is. I know those things, but if you ask me a book title or something that we talked about 10 minutes ago, it's just escaped my brain.
I always thought it was funny how my grandmother used to go down the list of all her grandchildren and pets before she called my name. Now I start to get it. So the book in question is Metaphors We Live by George Lakoff. It's a classic in the linguistic theory area, but separating literary metaphor from conceptual metaphor, I think, starts there. For anyone who's interested in this topic, that book, I think, is a must-read. A lot of the information is rolled up in academia, unfortunately, which makes, behind all the paywalls, some of the really interesting articles that are cited are hard to get at. But one that's floating around, the shift from metaphor to analogy in Western science, like those are the two places to start with metaphor in my mind. And that's what I plan to build my whole thing around as when I finally get around to writing it all down. Diedrich Gettner and Michael Jeziorsky, The Shift from Metaphor to Analogy in Western Science. The whole philosophy of science talks about the theory and intersubjectivity and knowledge and all of that. And David Easton's political science systems work from the 60s is also a great source material. I think I already plugged Agnomia, 12thprinciple.org. We've talked about all day. And, you can find me on Twitter as Logosity, and logosity.net's where I've been blogging notes these days.
I think that's a good start for everyone to look into. We'll be sure to get all of those items linked into the show notes so that you can all take a look into those materials. And the next time we're talking to Bill, perhaps we'll get some listener questions about these very deep topics. I mean, these are not trivial discussions and trivial ideas to dig into. There's a lot of deep research and thinking behind them. Certainly not easy topics.
No, I mean, I find them fascinating. Ultimately, they may lead us nowhere. But I feel like if I'll leave you with a great quote that I think sums it all up. It's from Karl Popper, the philosopher from the early part of the 20th century. He says, nevertheless, there are still some who do believe that philosophy can compose genuine problems about things, and if by chance they find themselves unable to accept any of the existing creeds, all they can do is to begin afresh from the beginning. I like going back to the beginning. I like to start projects with the assumption that nothing is set in stone, and solve for my processes. It's surprising how fast you can get to a good process that way versus chipping away at all the preconceived notions. And sometimes I think it's a good way to figure out what the heck we're doing, even if ultimately we're left with saying, "Yeah, we don't know what we're doing." Well, that's useful too.
Totally agree. Well, thank you, Bill. Really appreciate it.
Same here. I love being on the show. This was great, and I really like what you're doing here. This is a really cool thing that you've got going on.
And I'm your host, Ryan Ripley. No plugs this week. I will plug one thing. So Bill brought up Extreme Programming Explained, my all-time favorite book. I think it's if we would have stopped there in the Agile movement, we would be that would have been enough. I think Kent Beck gave us a real gem of a novel, and if you guys have not read that, I think it's a must-read. If you're listening to this podcast, I believe that there's a high likelihood that you'll love that book. So that'll be my plug for the week. Otherwise, 2016 is setting up to be a great year for the podcast. We're getting some really fun guests lined up, along with some of the old favorites that people have really enjoyed hearing. So again, I can't thank everyone enough. 2015 was a great year for the podcast. We've gone back and looked at some of the numbers, some of the downloads, the shares, all the things that all of you are doing to spread the word and to get the listenership moving in the right direction, and just cannot say enough times how grateful we are for all of you listening to the podcast, for being there, and for sharing your ideas and the podcast. So thank you again, and we're looking forward to a great 2016. And with that said, Bill, thank you again for joining me, and everyone have a great night.
Thanks for listening to Agile for Humans. Let's keep the conversation going. Drop us a question on Twitter @AgileForHumans or visit agileforhumans.com.